Okay. Welcome, everyone. My name is Michelle Stahl. I'm the Executive Director of the Monadnock Center for History and Culture. And thank you for coming out tonight for Recovering Black History in the Monadnock Region. This is a collaborative project between the Monadnock Center and the Historical Society of Cheshire County. And tonight's program is offered in partnership with our friends at Peterborough Town Library. Now, I'll just repeat it one more time for the folks who've come in just in the last couple minutes. We're going to do questions through the chat feature. We'll answer questions at the end. And let's get started with, I'm going to share my screen now. Okay. Now, can everybody see that? We're all good? Mary, Roxanne, we're good?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, great. All right. So if we don't get to your question at the end, you can email me. My email address is there on the screen, director@monadnockcenter.org, and I will answer everyone's questions. So as I said, this is a collaboration between us and the Historical Society of Cheshire County. We started a couple years ago, and the idea was that we were going to try to reconstruct and recover information about Black history in the Monadnock region. The project spans 1790 to 1930, and we started with 1790 because that's the first US federal census was conducted in 1790. But many of the records that we're uncovering now actually predate that. And I'm going to give you a brief overview of the project itself and how we're going about it. And then we'll get on to introducing you to some of the people we've found and tell you about two mysteries that we hope you may be able to help us to solve. The goals of this project really are about telling a more complete history. That research is going to inform things like programs and exhibits and school programs. And we are also in the beginning stages of planning for a website so that we can share the people and their lives and their experiences as broadly as possible. And also to connect up with the Black Heritage Trail of New Hampshire has an online database at blacknewengland.org. And we hope that our research will be able to mesh in with their online database and be part of that larger picture of Black history in New Hampshire and New England. Now, I do want to say a couple of notes. A note on language. During the talk, there will be things like words like Negro, colored, and I'm using those in the context of the historical records. Also, I do know that tonight we have some folks who are a little further afield than the Monadnock region, visiting us from other parts of the state and from Massachusetts. So all place names are going to be New Hampshire unless I specifically say it's another state. Now, this idea of telling a more full history. Now, interest in local history and the very earliest work that was done on local history in New England, a lot of that can really be traced to the years following the Civil War. And this is just a selection of local town histories, just to give you an idea. So many of these town histories are published in the 20 years or so after the Civil War. So you have Antrim in 1880, Peterborough in 1876, et cetera. And the reason for that is that after the Civil War, people were really looking back to the nation's past, to the founding of the democracy, to reconnecting with those ideals that made us a union after, a really bloody, divisive conflict. And they wanted to reunite the country. So looking back to that founding of the country and the settlement of our own communities was a way to connect back to that. Also during this period, here in the Monadnock region, our settlement period really dates to about the 1730s. So we don't have 1600 dates here. That's before European settlers were coming into this part of New England. But those folks who were coming in the 1730s, 40s, and 50s, their grandchildren, by the time of the US centennial in 1876, were in their very elderly years. And these local historians realized if we don't capture this, if we don't capture the information that these people have that was told to them by their grandparents, it will be lost forever. Albert Smith, the historian of Peterborough, wrote in 1876 in his preface to this history, "What little we have saved is now put into a permanent form for another century." And that's really what the idea behind these were. But also, we need to understand that these were histories of their people. They were the histories of the white European settlers who came into this area in the 18th century, and most notably Scotch-Irish settlers, who many of our towns were settled by Scotch-Irish immigrants. People of color, Black people, women, Indigenous people, they are often left out of these. And very rarely is information about Black people and families included in these volumes. Now, a quick note about the research itself. So we have 37 towns that span 2 counties, and the Historical Society of Cheshire County and the Monadnock Center just kind of divided up the region roughly east and west. And I have been supervising the work on the stuff on the right-hand side of the screen. We decided to take a very methodical approach because we didn't want to leave really any stone unturned. And so I think of it as being this kind of archives archaeology. It's kind of like strata of resources and sources, some of them primary source, some of them secondary source. But the top layer, the layer that we wanted to start with, was the US federal censuses, and then the town and county histories, many of which were published in the late 19th century, and then going from there into further layers. And we also wanted to be able to do this using a group of volunteers. So we had to be able to do a lot of it online. And luckily, we've reached a point with digitized archives and digitized documents that many things can be found online that 30 years ago would not have been accessible. And like archaeology, as not every trench is going to have every layer of strata. And when we do find things in a layer, we start making connections between those things and we start digging deeper. And that has certainly been the process that the volunteers have gone through with this method. And then we had to have a way to collect it, and we needed to be consistent. We needed to be able to connect each piece of information to its source. So we developed a collection mechanism using a Google form, very simple, and it was free. And it made it easier to enter the data. We could enter the data very consistently. And it also prevented any accidental corruption of the information. All of that goes into, it basically populates a spreadsheet. And the spreadsheet is only accessible to the project leads, myself and Jennifer Carroll at Historical Society of Cheshire County. So we can't have someone accidentally like mix things up or delete something. The spreadsheet, and I know you can't read all the little lines there, but the spreadsheet, what it is each data line represents information about one person from one particular source. And so far, 1,112 data lines, which is pretty darn good. But what have we found? What we found is 300 individuals from the colonial period to 1930, living in the Monadnock Region towns. Of the first two layers of sort of the research strata, the censuses and the town and county histories, I would estimate we're about 80% of the way through those. So this number will continue to grow. And as we get into other kinds of records, the number will continue to grow. So 300 named individuals, and there are several dozen additional people who've been found through the censuses, but we don't have them identified by name yet. These are 300 people whose lives and experiences can be traced, uncovered, reconstructed by connecting that info and digging deeper. Now, I mentioned that these early town histories, they don't record a whole lot about Black people in the region. But there's an exception here. The Antrim town history has 3 Black families included in its genealogical record. And I'm going to tell you, almost all of these have a genealogical record. And the reason for that is probably the influence of this man, Nathaniel Parker. Now, the Reverend Cochrane, who wrote the Antrim town history, said that Parker was kind, industrious, and smart. His memory has been of a great service in preparing this book. Parker came to Antrim in 1809 at the age of 7 to work for a builder named David Macaulay. And now that sounds strange. It's not unusual, not just for Black young men, but for white children as well. Large farm families typically would send children out to work on another farm or with a tradesman. They would learn a skill, and it would also take economic pressure off the family because really, literally, that's one less mouth to feed. Parker was the son of a formerly enslaved man named Caesar Parker, who had been enslaved in Litchfield. He gained his freedom at the time of the Revolution. After that, he married and had a large family, mostly sons. And they set up a farm in Mount Vernon. Now, Nathaniel, after coming here to Antrim as a child, continued to live in Antrim for the rest of his life. He worked as a farmer and then later as a peddler. And you can see in this census from 1840 that Nathaniel Parker owns his own farm. It's worth $2,900. And I can tell you, that is one of the most valuable farms that was found on this page of the census. Nathaniel Parker shows up in the Peterborough transcript in 1888. He is the oldest man in Antrim. And this story recounts where he came from, and but also gives us a little clue about something. Nathaniel Parker was an inventor. He invented something called the Parker Spool curve. And the Parker Spool curve has to do with horses. It says that this invention was well known among the horsemen of New Hampshire and Connecticut. Unfortunately, and this is the first mystery that I bring to you tonight and hope somebody can solve this. We haven't been able to find out anything about Parker's spool curve. So if there's any horse people out there who think they might know what this is, we'd really love to hear from you. Now, Nathaniel Parker, he never married, and he passed away in Goffstown at the age of 94 in 1896. The Reverend Cochrane also talks about Abigail Stewart and her husband, John Stewart. Now, just a little geography for those who aren't familiar. Abigail and John lived in a section of Antrim called the North Branch, which is up here. Today, we think of the center of Antrim as being down in the lower right-hand corner, but in fact, historically, Antrim, the greatest amount of settlement was further north, closer to today's Hillsborough line. But this couple offers a really intriguing look at life in one of these settlement communities in the 18th century, but it also illustrates some of the difficulties that we encounter with this kind of research. Now, Antrim is sort of lucky because there was an even earlier history that was put together by Dr. John Whiten. And in it, he describes the couple. She had a slight tinge of African, as her husband was said to have had of Indian blood. Mrs. Stewart, familiarly known of old as Granny Stewart, was a kind, neighborly woman, an excellent nurse, a self-taught doctress, ready to aid the sick by day or night, and often useful before there was a regular physician in the place. She died 1800. Cochrane describes her as, quote, a woman of great endurance, excellent in sickness. She took the place of a doctor in the new settlement, being always ready for many years to start at any hour of the day and night in service to the suffering. She did a great deal of good in her day. It's so amazing to have such a vivid description of her. Now, there was no doctor in Antrim until after 1786, and the closest doctor was in Hillsborough and would have only been called in for the most severe cases. What kind of medicine would Abigail Stewart have practiced? We can't say exactly, but certainly she would have had remedies, plant-based remedies. She would have been doing things like setting bones, treating wounds, and midwifery. She would have been a vital and well-known member of the community, and she was obviously highly regarded. It is so rare and wonderful to have this kind of description. But the record trail for this couple reveals some of the difficulties. Now, we found a marriage record from Ipswich, Massachusetts, for a couple named John Stewart and Abigail Phipps. Both Cochrane and Whiten mentioned that Abigail's maiden name was Phipps. So we thought, well, we're on the right track here. This is actually, this is an intention of marriage, which is dated November 7th, 1754. Their marriage actually happened in January of 1755. But there's no indication of race in this record. And in looking through the town clerk's record for this period in Ipswich, he does record the race of other people, other Black people. Because in all of these records, you'll notice as we go through, I'm going to show you a lot of different kinds of records tonight. In all of these records, it's assumed you're white. And then if you're not, then it's noted. So we just don't know if this is the right John and Abigail Stewart or not. And the names John Stewart and Abigail Stewart are very, very common names in 18th century New England. And the last name Stewart has a multiple of varied spellings, as you can see in this record where it's spelled S-T-E-W-A-R-D. The other difficulty in looking for more records about this couple, I think it's pointed out by the description that Whiten gives us, that they both were described as having blood. He doesn't say Abigail is Black and John is Indian. He says that they have blood, which leads me to think that they were mixed race. They may have been very light-skinned. They may have passed for white, and it certainly would have been easier to pass for white. You wouldn't have been subjected to the same kind of racism that someone who couldn't pass for white would be. But we can't fill out their story until we find more records that help us to connect up and make sure that we know who they are. Now, this particular John Stewart and Abigail Phipps Stewart, they go on to have a number of children, and some of those children have descendants. So if we can prove that this is the right couple, then we definitely have a very rich and multi-generational story that can be told there. Now we're going to move on to Peterborough and tell you about Dinah Freeman and her family. Now, Dinah Freeman is a little aside here. Dinah Freeman is actually the reason I got started on this research to begin with, because about 20 years ago, I ran across something in the church records that said Dinah Freeman admitted to full communion. She was a colored woman. And I was like, whoa, who is this woman? How did she end up in Peterborough? What's her story? And finally, 20 years later, we're getting to the bottom of her story. So much of what we know has been pieced together from the records. This image right here is the 1820 census. And what it shows us, if you look to the right-hand column, those are the columns for free people of color. The middle columns, those are for white people. In her household, and notice that she is the head of household, which means there is not an adult man head of household there. She has one young man, about 20 years old, a young woman, and then a woman over age 45, which would be Dinah herself. We don't find the Freeman family in the 1800 and the 1810 censuses for Peterborough. But we do find them in other records. And the earliest one is this. This is Elijah Dunbar. He was the minister of the church in Peterborough in 1803. This transcription was made of his church record in about 1920. And he says that on July 31st, 1803, he attended the funeral of Phila Freeman, a Negro child, age 7 years, daughter of Dinah Freeman. When he says attended, he means that he conducted the funeral, not that he went. And as I said, this is the earliest record. So that places Dinah and her family in Peterborough as early as 1803. By looking at all the various records that we are able to find, baptism, marriage, school, death, and land records, we're able to piece together Dinah's family. So we know that Dinah was born about 1768. She dies in 1834. Her daughter, Margaret, who is also known as Peggy, was born in the 1790s. And then Phila, who I just showed you the funeral record, she had another child, Oliver, who died as an infant, and then a son, Loring or Lauren, he shows up both ways in the records, who's born in 1797. Loring marries a woman named Polly, who was from Vermont, and they have one child, Sapphira or Sophia, born about 1834-35. Loring dies in 1835, and Sapphira may well have been born after Loring's death. She may have been pregnant with Sophia when he died. Polly Freeman goes on to marry a man named John White of Manchester, Vermont, and moves there. And the two of them have another daughter named Mary, born in 1844. Unfortunately, I have not been able to locate what happens to Sophia and Mary. Polly herself dies in 1860, relatively young woman at 52. This is a Bile Abbott's church record that shows Loring Freeman's death at the age of 38 in 1835. And the last of the Freemans in Peterborough was Peggy. And what this tells us is that the Freemans were living in Peterborough from as early as 1803 up to 1866. And Peggy is buried in the village cemetery in Peterborough. But what they don't tell us is what Dinah and her children were like. How did they make their living? And how did they even end up coming to Peterborough? So strangely enough, I don't even remember how I ran across this, but in our archives, we have this manuscript volume that was done by a man named Samuel Smith in the around 1830. And basically, I think Samuel Smith was thinking about writing an early history of Peterborough, because he goes through this book, basically just going from farm to farm and writing down what he knows about them. And I was in there looking for something and I ran across this. Whoa. So Dinah Freeman, colored, And it says that her house is on the Templeton farm. She built it and lives there. No land, but what the house stands on, to go to Mr. Templeton when she is dead. So now we know she was living in her own house on the Templeton farm. So that's, an incredible clue. And then we put Dinah Freeman and Peggy Freeman through a keyword search in the Peterborough transcripts online. And by the way, if you've never used those, you should really check it out. You can access them through the Peterborough Town Library website. And that turned up an article about an old schoolhouse that was written in 1911. And that revealed this. He's talking about the locations of the schoolhouses and the land around them. And he says, on the north side of the same highway is a cellar hole where once stood a house owned by the widow Dinah Auld, then Caleb F. Wilder owned it, and it was occupied by a colored family consisting of Peggy Freeman and others. And a school was kept in the house after the schoolhouse was burned and before the new schoolhouse was built. So I look at this, and I'm like, Dinah Auld. Dinah Auld. That's just too much of a coincidence. And then I remembered a footnote that said, this is from the Centennial Address in 1839. There have been in this town 8 slaves, 2 Baker and Rose belonging to Deacon Moore, 2 to David Steele, 2 to Samuel Auld. That was absolutely like, whoa. Is Dinah Auld Dinah Freeman? So I quickly looked up the Auld genealogy. No women named Dinah. And I knew that Dinah was a very common name given to enslaved women in the 18th century and the 19th century. And oftentimes, when people gained their freedom, they didn't want to retain their enslaver's name. And the name Freeman was very, very common for folks to take as a surname. An 1811 deed between Templeton and a man named Miller refers to Dinah Auld's house in the same location. All the evidence points to Dinah Auld being Dinah Freeman. The author of that Schoolhouse article also produced a map. And it shows the location of the Freeman house. Now, I'm not showing you the entire map, and I've actually even erased a few things from what I am showing you because I'm being purposely vague about the location of this house. For one, it's on private property, and I don't want to be, the person who sent people out there to poke around on somebody else's property. And also, I'm exploring the idea that there could be archaeology here. So I cannot wait until snow melts, because with this map, we can actually really locate this within a few hundred feet. So hopefully we're going to find that cellar hole. We know it was there in 1911, and hopefully we're going to be able to find it now. So in that reference to the enslavers in Peterborough, they mentioned 2 enslaved people by name, Baker Moore and Rose. Now, Baker Moore's life, unlike Dinah's, is recorded in some remarkable detail, both in the records, like church records and censuses and things like that, but also within the archives at the Monadnock Center. We haven't had the opportunity to explore very many of the folks that we found at this archival level. And the reason that we've been able to do this is because I'm at those archives every day. So I'm able to go and look things up, and also have other volunteers that are working on things and finding things. Now, we don't know a lot about Rose. We do know that Deacon Samuel Moore, who came to Peterborough as a settler in about 1751, did make a provision in his will that his son was to care for Rose for the rest of her natural life. Now, by the time he made that will in 1791, slavery is not really recognized anymore in New Hampshire as being legal. But there are cases of people remaining enslaved well after that time, and certainly Rose was one of those. Rose disappears from the census records after 1810, and I'm assuming that she must have died somewhere between 1810 and 1820, because she's in Samuel's son's household in 1810, and then she's not there in 1820. But Baker, who lived a very long life, his story we know a lot about. Samuel's sister, Mary Moore, lived in Londonderry, and actually Samuel lived in Londonderry before he came to Peterborough. She was a weaver. The weavers of Londonderry were very well known for their linen, and she takes a load of cloth to Boston in 1755 and sells it to a merchant. After the sale, and the story is told two ways, either he sells her this child or he gives her a child, but he offers her an infant born of one of his slaves, of an infant boy. And Mary takes him back to Londonderry into her household. And there she sends him to school, and she names him Sam Jones after the merchant. When he's at school, the other boys nickname him Baker. We don't know why. And Baker Moore is the name that he uses for the remainder of his life. When he was 10 years old, Mary Moore sold Baker to her brother Samuel for $250. And that's when he comes to Peterborough. Now, Samuel and his wife were not benign slaveholders. When Baker Moore disobeyed, or they felt he was, shrugging off his work or not working to the capacity they wanted, Samuel beat him with a rod. And his wife would say, "Pay him well for it, Samuel." So I don't want to paint any kind of picture that this was somehow not slavery, because it was. The family story is that in 1777, when Baker Moore was 22 years old, Samuel Moore sold him his freedom for $200. And then it's always noted that Baker never paid. Not really sure where he would get $200, but they always have to tell you that he never paid the debt. But it does appear from the census records that Baker continued to live in the Moore household. Later, in 1820 and 1830, we find Baker in his own household living by himself. After he gained his freedom, he made his living as a fiddler. And this reminiscence that was written by Judge Nathaniel Holmes and printed in the Peterborough transcript in 1889 describes him. And it talks about how he was always a welcome guest, and he always had his little green flannel bag with his fiddle, and the kids really loved him. But Nathaniel Holmes also recounts that origin story of Baker being born in Boston in 1755 and taken in by Mary Moore and then sold to Samuel. And he says in the article that he heard that story from Baker's own lips. So that's pretty amazing to be able to have that story of exactly when he was born, where he was born, how he came to be in Peterborough. But I also want to tell you that being a fiddler is a really important role in the late 18th and early 19th century in New England and in New England towns. Dancing was central to social life. This is a dance caller's notebook. They called them prompters, a dance prompter. And this is what today you would know as contra dancing. But this traditional style of dancing is the kind of dancing they were doing. Those fiddlers, they performed an essential function. There were formal dances, there were house dances, they were called kitchen junkets, I love that term. There was music and dancing in the tap rooms, in the taverns. It was a huge part of social life. Now, in our archives, we have another reminiscence of Peterborough during the 1820s and 30s, written by a woman named Celinda Hill Holt. And she says that Baker would call at the various taverns and boarding houses, and to the mill girls, and those are the ones that were living in the boarding houses, he would say, "Come, girls, have a dance. What tune will you have?" In his last years, Baker's health fails him, and he ends up living on the town poor farm until his death on February 20th, 1839. And this is Reverend Abigail Abbott's record of Baker Moore's death. He's 84. The cause of death is decay, which in those days meant old age. And then it says, "Negro, a slave when young of Deacon Samuel Moore." Now think about that. Even in his death record, they have to identify him as a slave. He has been a free man for 62 years. Yet he's still identified in this sort of final document of his life as a slave. And then we found another primary source, a letter from a woman named Eliza Morrison Felt to her brother, dated March 1st, 1839. "Old Baker died last week. He had been in a wretched suffering condition all winter. I believe he had more friends than many white people and better improved the talents given him, and now has gone where there'll be no distinction made in regard to color." Baker Moore is buried in an unmarked grave in the East Hill Cemetery in Peterborough. But the story does not end there. And now for the second mystery that I mentioned. The woman on the right is Celinda Hill Holt, who gave the reminiscence about Baker. And by the way, she's also the reason we know that he's buried in East Hill, because that was part of her reminiscence. And she says that Baker had a dark-skinned face surrounded by white curls. He was always with his green flannel bag, and his fiddle was always at his side. She says that in the 1830s, in Baker's elder years, a portrait was painted of Baker. It was done by subscription, and it hung in French's Tavern. Now, when they say paid for by subscription, I think we can all sort of picture it. All the guys are sitting around the tap room, and they're talking about the itinerant painter that's in town doing people's portraits. And someone says, "We should have a portrait of Baker." And then they all took up a collection and gathered up the money and then paid to have Baker's portrait painted. And it hung in French's Tavern's tap room for many years until, as Celinda says, until fly speck and tobacco smoke obscured it and it quietly disappeared. Now, it's a real long shot, but could Baker Moore's portrait still be out there somewhere? The tavern was built in 1833. So in those days, when that portrait was made, the tavern was brand new. And it was in business until the 1960s. And in 1965, it was purchased by Peterborough Savings Bank with the plan to tear it down and build a new bank building there. And when they did that, they had an auction of the contents. And not everything sold at the auction. So a couple days before the wrecking balls are coming, the bank invited people to come in for a scavenger hunt and take whatever they wanted. And in fact, I can tell you that that sign in the picture that says "Good Lodgings, Coffee Shop, Dining Room" is actually in the basement of the Monadnock Center. A lot of this tavern ended up there. And people went in and just gathered things up and took them home. Now, we also know that this is New England and nobody throws anything away. So when that portrait was taken down from the wall, I doubt it was just thrown out. It was probably tucked into a corner or, in a closet or up in the attic. And perhaps somebody in 1965 picked it up. We do know that there were four itinerant painters in Peterborough in the early 1830s. What might it have looked like? It could have been quite small, like this picture of Celinda Hill, which was actually painted by her sister Caroline Hill. It could look like the image of tavern keeper James Wilson, or this painting of the dance prompter Phineas Taggart. These are all local images, Peterborough images that were done by itinerant painters in the 1830s. And when I put them all up here, I realized every single one of these people knew Baker Moore. Celinda knew him from him coming to the boarding houses where the mill girls were, because she was a mill girl. James Wilson was a tavern keeper. He kept the Wilson Tavern in another part of Peterborough. And Phineas Taggart was a dance prompter. So Baker Moore probably fiddled at some of Phineas's dances. I do think it's likely that if this portrait exists, that it would look something like the one in the middle, which is by an artist named William Matthew Pryor, or the Pryor Hamlin School. There were a number of artists working in William Matthew Pryor's business. And the reason I think that is because William Matthew Pryor is one of the few itinerant New England folk artists that we know painted images of Black people. Here are 3 of the 9 known portraits done by William Matthew Pryor in his circle of Black people in 19th century New England. The painting would be probably about 10 by 14 inches, maybe a little bit bigger. It's going to be oil or something called gouache, which is an opaque watercolor, on an artist's board. It's possible that it could be on canvas, but canvas paintings were more expensive. And given the fact that this painting of Baker Moore was done by subscription, they probably didn't go for the highest priced painting. And all of these itinerant artists had tiers, so you could get sort of the cheapest paintings or the middle grade painting, and then the painting with all the bells and whistles. The one on the right of William Whipper would be all the bells and whistles. It might have the green bag and the fiddle, because often attributes of the sitter would be included. So, have you seen it? And if you have, you need to let me know right away. And that is the final mystery. I hope that you can help us solve it. I want to thank you all for listening. I hope that you've enjoyed this. And I also want to thank all of the citizen archivists. These are our volunteers who have helped with this project. And we could not have done any of this without you. And now I'm going to go back. I'm going to stop sharing the screen and take questions. All right. Let's see, we've got. All right, so someone put a comment in. Phila is short for Philadelphia, might have a connection to Pennsylvania's 1780 gradual abolition law. And then Ona Judge had a sister named Philadelphia for that reason. That's an interesting fact. That is interesting. I was not aware of that. So that will be something that I'll try to think about and see how that works in. Language is important. Instead of saying slaves, we should use enslaved Africans. That way we identify them as human. Yes, absolutely. When we say slave, We're reducing a person's entire identity to a condition that was imposed upon them by force. Someone else, I'm really appreciating hearing this incredible history. Thank you. Just to point out that benign is not an adjective that would describe anyone owning people. That's right. Someone says the Parker spool curve is possibly a bit for the bridle. My horse friend shared this with me. Great. All right. Wow, I really thought I was going to run out of time, and I'm actually finishing up a little bit ahead of time. Does anybody have any other questions before we wrap up for tonight? If you do, you could unmute if you want.
Hey, Michelle, it's Mary.
Yes.
So how can all of these people who've watched this amazing program help you and participate in furthering your work?
Yeah, so if you're interested in getting involved in the research, we would be happy to be able to bring you on board. One of the nice things about the way we've done the research is that we can get people in at different points, at sort of different jumping off points. We do have some towns we haven't even touched yet, so there's still plenty to do. So you can get in touch with me or with Jennifer Carroll at Historical Society of Cheshire County.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing that you can do is, and this is, just the reality of these things, both the Monadnock Center and the Historical Society of Cheshire County are private nonprofit organizations, and we're both membership organizations. So if you want to make this kind of work keep on happening, become a member, and we would appreciate that. Yeah, and the other thing that you can do is just tell your friends about it. The research is not everybody's cup of tea. It's a lot of hours, and it's for some of us it's really fun, and for others it's not. It doesn't click for them. So you can help us by letting other people know that this work is going on. I see that Lynn has a question or a comment. Go ahead, Lynn.
Just a comment. Nathaniel Parker's brother, Ransom, also was working out. He lived in Hopkinton in his teen years that we know of. We don't know who exactly he was living with, and his name's not in the census, but somebody tracked him down as he was studying at the Methodist school in Massachusetts, and it said he was from Hopkinton, so we did some work. He ended up being a teacher in Rhode Island, which is why Caesar, his father, you had that down there. Caesar was in Rhode Island. He was with Ransom.
Oh, okay.
Point. And Ransom had some kids who went off to Africa and came back. So it was very, very interesting history. And I featured him as a character in the Putney Hill Cemetery walk.
Nice. Yeah, so Caesar Parker, Nathaniel's father, ends up eventually living in Rhode Island, and that's what brought him there was his son Ransom. What an amazing family. I mean, when you think about all these sons, wouldn't it be interesting to find out what happens to all of them and
to the rest
what they end up doing in their lives? Yeah, Hopkinton makes perfect sense, though. If they were living in Mount Vernon, Nathaniel ends up in Antrim, one ends up in Hopkinton. These are all very, pretty close together. So nice.
Yeah.
Thank you for making that connection.
He got a great education. So we're not sure how that happened, but pretty neat.
Yeah. That's fantastic. Anyone else? I don't see any other raised hands, but really, if you have a question, feel free to go ahead and unmute and ask your question. Well, if we don't have any other questions, we can go ahead and wrap up for tonight. But again, I thank you so much for coming. And I'm really looking forward to the time where we can give you further updates and introduce you to some more of your neighbors. All right, so we'll end now. Thank you all. Good night.
Thank you, Michelle. Take care.